the NCAA very well may be crumbling right before our very eyes, and it's likely going to have an impact on the Gators more than maybe we all realize. Let's talk about what happened and what it means for UF coming up next. Okay, so what happened? The courts just ruled that the NCAA can't enforce NIL rules or penalties at the moment. So they granted a temporary injunction in favor of Tennessee and Virginia in their lawsuit. We all know that Tennessee basically is fighting back against the NCAA and the investigation that the NCAA has launched into Tennessee and their handling of NIL. Their president came out with a really strong statement a couple of months ago where she essentially just said, like, no, we followed the rules. You're the one that continues to change the rules. And now that a rule is different at this moment, you can't retroactively go back and punish us. We're not going to stand for it. We are going to challenge this legally. They've been joined by the state of Virginia, who also feels obviously the very same way. If you followed this channel for any amount of time, you will know that we had on a Tennessee podcaster who feels very, very strongly about what Tennessee's doing, and actually also thinks that there's a chance that the state of Florida even joins into this lawsuit at some point. But this is really interesting. This is kind of opening Pandoras Box, right? Because at the moment, the NCAA has no teeth. They have no ability to go after schools for violating any NIL rules or penalties until this court case is fully settled. This is a huge win for Tennessee. It's a huge win, for all of these programs that are being investigated. Florida's one of them. Don't forget, Florida is being investigated by the NCAA for their handling of the Jaden Rashada recruitment. We all remember what happened with Jaden Rashada. Florida eventually let him out of his letter of intent. They couldn't come to an agreement, supposedly on numbers. He is now the quarterback at Arizona State, but that is what Florida is currently being investigated for by the NCAA. So this is interesting. This gives Florida the opportunity to fight back. This gives Florida the opportunity. They could join this lawsuit. They could, put out some strongly worded statements. They could, instead of what normally happens with NCAA investigations, not just to Florida, but pretty much anywhere, is that the NCAA says, hey, listen, here is what we have on you. This is the worst case scenario. Do you want to negotiate so we can get to some sort of punishment that makes everybody happy? Essentially. So these schools negotiate. This is exactly what Florida State did just recently. They negotiate on what the penalty is going to be, and then it's kind of jointly announced, as opposed to what's happening in this Tennessee situation, which is where they're refusing to play ball with the NCAA. They're not saying, I'm not coming to the table to discuss a penalty that we can all feel good about. We don't feel good about any penalty. Instead, we will take you to court. So that's what's going on right now. Gives Florida a really interesting opportunity. Now, why did the court grant an injunction? Ultimately, they don't like anything that forces employee restrictions without employee benefits. For example, limiting the amount of money that players can earn, or even what they can earn it for. And I think this is kind of where we're headed with college football. So what I think eventually happens is that these student athletes will become employees of the universities or contractors of the universities. Currently, they are contractors of these third-party collectives. They sign a contract with them. The contract says, you're going to do XYZ for us, and we are going to pay you ABC. That's how this works. A lot of them have some, you're going to attend this number of events, you're going to sign this number of things, however the contract is structured. That's how this works right now with NIL and these third-party collectives. I do think eventually these contracts will exist between a student athlete and the university, but nobody at the NCAA thinks that the rules apply to them. Essentially, they don't think that the rules of the Constitution apply to them, the legal laws that exist about employee rights. And this court is saying, we think they do. We think that this applies in this situation. So, this could be a really good thing for UF. As of now, I would assume that the investigation is paused because the NCAA can't levy penalties at UF at the moment. And if the courts do eventually rule in the favor of Tennessee and Virginia for the long term, then the investigation is just over, right? Because these things are legal. Now, that's going to be maybe a bad thing overall for college football. There has got to be some sort of guardrails in place for how NIL works. We think it's the Wild West now. Just wait if the courts say that the NCAA is not allowed to impose any sort of rules at all. Tampering and NIL are going to get even more insane. This injunction technically says that anything goes, right? That you can entice these players with whatever you want, whenever you want. That's going to change the college football landscape, and I think for the worst over the long term, if this is allowed to stay without any restrictions or supervision at all. Okay. Imagine universities being able to call up your players in October and saying like, hey, why don't you just go ahead and make the jump? We're ready for you. We want you now. We've got a bigger bag. That kind of thing is going to happen. Or, as soon as you sign with a school, you've still got other schools continuing to pursue you. It's going to be chaos and madness. There has to be some sort of governing body that creates a set of rules that everybody can play within. And ultimately, I think that's probably going to come from the conference level. Right now, conferences get to create different rules for their members already in other arenas. And we saw when COVID happened, the NCAA looked to the conferences to kind of decide how we were going to move forward. And honestly, it was pretty successful doing it that way. So my guess is that's what happens. These conferences, and maybe they work together, right? We saw that SEC Big Ten commission kind of be put together a few weeks ago to look at the best interests of college football. Maybe that's how this comes about. But I do think there will be some sort of guidance that comes down from the conferences to kind of control this a little bit, because otherwise it's going to be mass chaos and insanity. But this is the NCAA's fault. They refuse to let players be paid. They wouldn't share in revenue because they're greedy. So what happens? Eventually people get fed up, and we've got states and the government that had to force the allowance of NIL, but now zero guardrails, and it's insane. So we've got the NCAA who's being reactive, not proactive, which is what they always do. And they're trying to figure out, okay, shoot, how do we reel this in? How do we fix this? How do we make this a little bit more fair? And surprise, surprise, they screw it up again. This is what the NCAA, instead of working on common sense rules, they go on these witch hunts about things that are irrelevant. And I know I've mentioned this. If you followed this channel for any period of time, I always talk about the fact that when my husband played, the NCAA didn't allow universities to serve bagels with cream cheese on it because the protein to carbs ratio wasn't within the window that they allowed. So that was actually at one point in time an NCAA violation. You have $10,000 cash handshakes going on that we're not going after, but we're sending strongly written memos about cream cheese on bagels. And that's kind of a microcosm of how the NCAA works, right? And that's what we're seeing here. They're seeing this spiral out of control, and they're trying to rein it back in, but they're getting it wrong. So where does this ultimately go? Well, we're going to have to stay tuned. This is going to be very interesting to watch. But ultimately, I think it's going to lead to players being employees and eventually even receiving a share in the revenue. There's just no way that it won't. I honestly think that in a few years, we're going to look back and we're going to say, how insane is it that we were expecting our fans who, let's say make $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year to subsidize paying for these athletes so that they can watch their teams potentially have a chance to play in the national championship when we're simultaneously watching universities and conferences sign TV deals worth billions of dollars. It's insanity. Revenue sharing is the way to go. These players are why these universities and these conferences are raking in the money. It only makes sense for them to get a piece of the pie. It should never be on the fans to make sure a university is successful on the field or not. So that's where I think this is going, but it's going to be really, really interesting to watch. And, the NCAA has a horrible record in court, mostly because they're a greedy organization that masquerades around pretending to care about the well-being of college athletes. We are closer now to the end of that organization than we have ever been. This Tennessee and Virginia lawsuit against them is going to ultimately bring around some of the biggest changes that our sport has ever seen. I'm interested to see how it all goes down, how it impacts UF, and what's next. So stay tuned and we will certainly keep you updated on it. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, go Gators.